All right, everybody, welcome back. This is The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and today we are discussing one of the most important topics of the day, that is Canada. What is it? Where did it come from?
What is this place?
Why?
Yeah, who is Canada?
Why is Canada? And Donald Trump's repeatedly stated desire to annex and or add Canada to the fold of the United States as the 51st state. Canada, one big 40 million person state.
Just a big old state. Yeah.
Which doesn't
two senators only? Is that what that is?
Yeah, basically. Oh. And then I think that's why. And Quebec will of course be thrilled at this, as they have no history of wanting to be their own country, as we know. Anyway, before we get into all that, we've got a couple of stories that are actually related pretty directly to our main topic this week. Let's start with the USA-Canada Four Nations hockey match, which I did not watch, being not a big hockey fan.
You're not a big hockey fan?
No, I mean, yeah, when I was growing up, it was like Rangers and Devils were good.
Yeah, it was it was more popular when you were younger.
That's right.
Like I feel like I had a moment in the mid-90s after Jordan retired.
That's right.
Where the hockey kind of took off, and then it was this disaster of negotiating broadcasting rights.
Well, then they lost a whole season, right? I mean,
yeah, and they couldn't get a major American partner to broadcast the games. I remember, this isn't that long ago, but I remember watching NHL playoff games on something called Versus. They basically negotiated. They just had the worst negotiating tactics ever. They lost NBC, I think, was the last one.
Yeah.
Then it started doing it like very rarely.
There's also remember the glowing puck?
Oh my God. I would tell you, man. So keeping it up to date with what happened. I watch way less hockey than I used to. Full disclosure for listeners, I grew up in Canada. So we get the biographical info.
It's come up once or twice before, Michael. But
yeah, sure. I'm born in New York City, and by the time I'm 5 years old, I am living in about an hour outside Toronto, and eventually, save for a brief trip to the UK, I then left in 2009 to move back to New York on the wings of optimism.
You're like, finally, it's safe for a Canadian to come home.
This is it. We did it. Yeah. And so I obviously would watch a ton of hockey, and it's just amazing to see the osmosis. You don't get that here, right? No. It's just not part of the fabric of sports.
It was for me when I was growing up, not just because of the era, but also because of where I lived, which is in Fairfield County, New Canaan, just outside New York, which was a huge preppy lacrosse hockey place, right? Yeah. And in the nature of things, I was a basketball guy and a baseball guy growing up. So didn't fit in. One of the many ways in which I did not fit in with that milieu.
Yeah. So one of the problems with hockey as well, in terms of like expanding the game, is they struggle to put together these what are called best on best tournaments. Like, think about the consistency of a soccer World Cup, right? So it's all this stuff always about whether the Olympics, all the best players will participate, and that there's the World Cup. It's all very convoluted, and it's sort of the NHL's version of whatever the hell they're trying to do in the NBA All-Star Game. They're just throwing gimmicks at the wall to try to see what sticks. And this is the Four Nations face-off, but basically designed to just make sure Canada and the U.S. play a couple times. Because the United States has gotten extremely good, unfortunately, for Canadians. And the gap is basically gone. And in fact, the U.S. was slightly favored, I think, against the Canada in
Montreal, right?
In Canada, which is, I don't know the last time Canada was an underdog on their own ice. Sidney Crosby has won 26 straight games. And so I tuned in for this because I was, I actually used to, as a child, actively cheer against Canada, just like I used to cheer US basketball. But in my older age, I like really stand for Canada hockey because it feels like it's all that's left. And there was the booing of the national anthem. This got some attention, right?
Yep.
And the booing is from the Trump stuff, right?
Of course.
That obviously something that does not happen often, and certainly Canadians don't do this that often. And the Kachuk brothers, I don't know if you're familiar. Some of our listeners
are they the sons of Keith Kachuk?
They are the sons of Keith Kachuk.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
That's a name I remember from childhood. Sure.
And I'm not entirely sure about Brady, but I know Matt's a huge Trump supporter, so I assume they all are.
Right.
But basically, they demanded to fight the second the puck dropped. So it was this very strange beginning to a game where there were 3 fights in the opening 9 seconds of play.
Yeah.
And then somewhat tragically, Canada went on to actually lose the game 3-1. So, I don't know if it's a sign of things to come, but it appears as though Canada's losing its grip on hockey domination, which might be a sign of the apocalypse for the podcast to consider.
Yeah, I would say so. Although, aren't some European teams are really good too now, right? Finland is one of the other teams that's in.
They're okay. They're okay, and it's not quite best on best this tournament, but typically when it is all the best guys, either Canada wins or it's considered a pretty substantial upset.
I see. Yeah.
Right.
Well, one would hope. Another Canada news, there was yet another plane crash. I think this is the 4th, maybe 5th plane crash that's happened since Trump was inaugurated. Mm-hmm. This one, however, in Toronto, but an American plane from Minneapolis, Delta flight, landed. No one died, thank goodness. That's positive. And flipped onto its top. You can see the photos online. They're quite disturbing. Seems bad. And on top of this, we get news that just today, as if, on call, the stars were aligned, Trump has fired 300 FAA workers, right?
Yeah. But don't worry, it's mostly just safety inspectors, mechanics. I mean, it is, what is it like? It wouldn't be possible for me to think that it could have gotten to this point this quickly. I think where it just feels like it's going to be this news. It will be interesting to see if eventually there is blowback on Doge and all of that.
Yeah.
Once this actually starts, not to say that these plane crashes aren't important or anything like that, they're also not necessarily indicative to this staffing situation, but the very functioning of the government is getting ground to a halt if they are successful with what they want to do. And
good luck getting your tax refund. I mean, it looks like they're going to try and fire as many people as humanly possible at the IRS. So.
That's right. And so one wonders what this actually looks like in a year, when some of this initial shock gives way to the complete dysfunction of the entire system. Because a lot of people actually, in typical American political fashion, people hate things, and then when they have them described to them, they like them, right? What's the famous polling?
The Affordable Care
Obamacare.
Act. They love the Affordable Care
Act. The Affordable Care Act. And are you going to see that sort of play out? But
I found myself as I was walking today being like, all right, well, it's just 47 more months of this.
Yeah, I mean, so we can hope. I mean, who knows, right? He did say that he doesn't consider Vance his successor.
He's looking into third term.
I think he's trying to hold on long enough where it's a seamless transition to the 22 or 23-year-old Baron, maybe?
Yeah, which would again be illegal, but as we've seen, the law seems to be extremely unimportant to
that's right.
To the sort of power grab. Yeah, the plane crashes, I don't know, is it a coincidence? Probably, right? I mean, we'd had a good 15, 16-year run without a major plane crash. Now we've had a big one and a number of lesser disasters. I don't think, I'm sure QAnon types are saying, oh, it's a deep state conspiracy to discredit. It's like, well,
yeah,
it's never.
I mean, everything is.
Yeah.
That's going to be the beauty of all of this, right? Is that it's a self-sealing logic, right? Like that's
everything.
Right. It's perfect. And so it's like when you don't You don't support the post office, and then it becomes a nightmare experience. And then people are like, we should get rid of the post
Yeah,
office.
exactly.
It's this exact thing that's been going on in American politics and the funding of government services as long as we've been alive. And like again, a lot of these things aren't new. This is what I was thinking about on my walk today is I was thinking about the Tea Party and the idea of this Doge cut everything that people are acting sort of shock and awed by, like who could have seen this coming? Like these things are all always happening in American politics, and it's not as though this is a new notion. It's just the fact that like the power is getting more centralized with the people who are actually going to make the cutting, right? And it takes a very long time, I think, for a country like America to really get down to the brass tacks of destroying its own government. And
Although we'll see. I mean,
well, I'm just saying, like, it's not to me, the idea that Trump is like, it's time to cut everything is not, this is not new, this
sure,
is what,
sure.
and the big question the right, is sort of forced to ask is like, were the things that the right has been saying my entire life, just lip service designed to get a base to vote for them, similar to the way the Democrats say certain things to get, their base to vote for them? And can they just not, can they actually handle the logical extension of some of the things that they've been talking about? And we'll see. Because the Tea Party definitely abolished the IRS. Like, you remember all of this stuff.
Oh yeah.
This is not,
Oh yeah.
this has been going on,
Well, I think the difference is, as you say, is before it's always felt to a certain extent like lip service. And we'll get into some of the sort of more foreign policy oriented
yeah.
aspects of this in a little bit. But before we do that, why don't we talk about Canada? What is Canada?
Yeah.
Where did Canada come from?
It's hard to say. Where did Canada come from? I think it was born in Britain. Is that right?
Well, it's a mix of French and British colonialism, right?
I know.
Yeah. British claimed the sort of maritime areas. They were contested. And I think also the western parts of Canada pretty early on, the sort of Vancouver, British Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
But there was a sort of leading up to the Revolutionary War, we've got a bunch of conflict. In fact, in the dreaded 7 Years' War, which happens in the 1750s and 60s, is when France, alas, loses its claim to the province of what is today Quebec, but also to parts of Maine, right? The so-called Acadia region of Maine. And Britain, since 1759 or so, has controlled all of Canada. And in a weird way, still has a nominal role in the Canadian government.
You've got some monarchists there still. The
Queen is on the money,
or
King Charles is on the money, presumably. Have they put him on the money yet? Or
I don't know. I was there recently, but I don't know.
Didn't use any cash, probably.
Don't use cash, no.
Yeah,
but I do. People do come out in a slightly different way. There are Canadians. Americans come out when the monarchy shows up in this weird like celebrity fascination.
That's right.
There are still people in Canada
who get like weepy,
less and less,
obviously, about like Prince Philip's death and stuff, posting these
that's right.
a lifetime of service from this chap. Like, what
we should also say this is not going to be a complete look at the history of Canada, but
no, not at all.
Canada before that and during this period you're talking about, also a similarly shameful treatment and exploitation and destruction of indigenous populations, and that continued well into modern Canadian history.
Yeah, in fact, and it's continuing to come out. That's one of my, and part of my dissertation is about Samuel Hearne, who was a British explorer who came to Canada and lived with indigenous peoples. And what my chapter on that is about how incredibly ambivalent he is towards his indigenous hosts. He's like, they're really cool. They're also demons. It's just this very bizarre. The customs are incredibly alienating to him as a British person.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like early piece of Canadian literature, actually, though I don't approach
Well,
it from that.
I think that really dark and brutal history and the sort of hiding of it or refusal to reckon with it
Yeah.
uh, is very indicative of something essential about Canada and its relationship to empire, colonialism, and America. Um,
Right, because
not
Canada
necessarily.
differentiates itself from America as being
That's
nicer, not as
right.
militaristic and whatever, and
Mm,
yet we find that it has much of the same history of colonial
certainly.
destruction and genocide, quite frankly. And in some
Well,
cases,
and like not also, you get the same sort of uh the modern day blowback of like anti woke who can't stand land acknowledgements, for
yeah.
example, like this type of thing, refusing to address anything that happened out of the like, why do I have to apologize for the sins of blah blah blah? It's not. This is the thing that I sort of dealt with both as somebody who ended up moving away,
Yep,
right,
yep.
and as when I was living there from the ages of essentially 5 to 25, that I really didn't I came to view Canada as like the most overrated country in the world, right? This is a place where um in the time period when Barack Obama was winning elections in America, Stephen Harper was the prime minister.
Yeah,
Now, in fairness, he never got over 39% of the
sure.
popular vote because
It's
they also
the
have
beauty of the parliamentary system,
the
Michael.
parliamentary system, but like come on, like given the way that these people were talking about the election of George W. Bush twice,
Yep,
right?
yep, yep.
The things that Canadians, the sort of like, wow, and it's like this Harper guy was an absolute nightmare as well, and the same goes for like the Trump stuff, right? There's a lot of not just anti-Trump stuff that's coming up more and more now that we'll get to with the tariffs and stuff. There's the idea of Trump as ridiculous, much like we have here in the
Well,
States.
as opposed to Justin Trudeau, who's never done
Well,
anything
it's
ridiculous in his
well,
life.
and like the Fords. Like,
Sure.
come on, like
Literally the crack addicted
that's
mayor
right. Like
of
Rob
Toronto, like
Ford was like sort of Trump before Trump.
caught on film so many times just
That's
doing the
right.
most
And
egregious
then,
stuff imaginable.
his the Ford Nation, all of these things that, and then even more recently, like the anti-vax stuff, so prevalent in Canada. Remember the truck
Well, I was just going to
convoy?
say the trucker convoys, and we haven't even
Yeah.
talked about Queen Romana Didelot, the self-appointed monarch of Canada.
It's
Um,
it's just the whole thing is like this strange history of differentiation that, eventually you sort of have to reckon with the fact that you two are ultimately a pretty conservative, G8 whatever powerhouse country as well.
yeah,
you know.
yeah. Um, Canada, I just wanted to add, was finally fully independent from the UK
Mhm.
only in the year before your birth, Michael, 1982. It
Yeah,
hardens
that's
me to know that I
pretty.
was alive for a full year of British sovereignty over Canada. I mean, it had largely been self-governing since the 1850s, I think, and had been co-equal with Great Britain since 1931. Still pretty funny. I mean, come
It's
on.
still just funny to have a governor general.
Yeah, and he's still
Like,
there, right? He
yeah,
in
well, I don't know who it
in
is right now. I don't.
right, but in theory, can't he like convene a new parliament or something? Like, doesn't he still
I
have?
have like
I
I have no idea how
I think he
anything works.
still does have some weird parliamentary authority in Canada, which seems hilarious. So
Yeah, no, I
the
definitely didn't pay attention to Canadian history. I'm not gonna lie. I feel like I learned more about U.S. history in Canadian high school than I did Canadian.
that tracks. Yeah, I think that's okay. I what I know about it is mostly just the sort of historical disasters, like that
Mhm.
explosion in that harbor during the war, and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
But
So
I think before we talk about the
the
thing that
reason we're
is
doing this episode, yeah,
the tariff, the Trump of it all, is that you are talking about a country that either has tried to distance itself from the worst excesses of American power, and again, certainly all the way back to colonial behavior, expansionism, all that stuff. But Through more modern times, similarly, whether it's with some sort of like ironic distance or superiority complex. And there are things, obviously,
I mean, the
whether
healthcare
it's
is better for now.
healthcare, although, there are millions of Canadians who are voting for people who are actively trying to destroy the Canadian healthcare system.
Yep.
Very similar to what we were talking about before, the sort of bleeding a thing dry and making it so it's not as effective, and then being like, look, we probably shouldn't have this
We've got
anymore.
no choice.
Right. But there's also been like, I think, some legitimate attempts to create some obstacles, some blocks of differentiation. Even culturally, right? So
Yeah,
there's like
the sort of Canadian culture,
Canadian content rule,
yeah, that's
right?
right, content.
Where certain amount of any type of media has to originate in Canada, and there's all kinds of hilarious criteria. There was one famous story, I think, where Bryan Adams, of Canadian descent, Waking Up the Neighbors. Are you familiar with this smash album?
Yeah, I love Bryan Adams.
Where there was some distinction about where it was recorded and whether it counted as Canadian content.
Because like too much of it, like 6 of the 11 tracks were recorded in Los Angeles or something.
But what it basically worked at, like my experience with the Canadian content is kind of like I hate Rush.
Sure, I was just going to mention Rush actually.
I'm
glad you went there.
I'm not even sure I would hate Rush if I had grown up in America and sort of been introduced to Rush.
Yeah.
But the amount of Rush that I had
shoved
down my Canadian throat has made it that I get sick. I get nauseous when I hear this, where that guy sings.
When you hear free Will or whatever.
Right.
One of their Ayn Randian anthems. Ironically, Rush, though Canadian, are also arch libertarians.
Right. And now Canada, I think, sort of segue into the main topic. It's like it finds itself starting to unfortunately deal with the reality of signing up with an incredibly powerful neighbor.
Yep.
When it finally starts to do the thing that it's been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, so what brought us to this topic, of course, is Trump's saber rattling, should we call it, about Canada becoming the 51st state, which is funny on several levels, because on the one hand, Canada has provinces, like it wouldn't all just be one state, surely. But I think we were talking beforehand a little bit, and like clearly the reason he wants it to be one state is just so they get 2 senators, and that's it.
It has to be, because also like this is not, despite everything I've just said about Canada, it is not a voting populace that Trump and the Republican Party would really welcome with open arms into their system. I mean, look how fragile the elections these people are winning already. You bring in 40 million people who, say what you will about guys like Stephen Harper or the Fords. They're probably not voting for guys like Donald Trump in actual huge electable numbers. You're talking about elections that are decided by a handful of percentage points at best, most often 1 or 2 percentage points, right? These days.
And if the Canadian provinces each became a state, for instance.
Sure. I mean,
how many Canadian provinces are there again?
10?
Well, there's territories too, so it's a little complicated.
I don't know.
But anymore. Basically, I would say all of them
them
except Alberta and maybe Manitoba would be obviously Democratic landslide, and even in those states, it would be even those provinces.
I mean, Alberta has like a secession movement.
They already want to join the United States.
It's not as long. It's not as historically driven and
as Quebec separatism.
But there are people there that are like, yeah, we would be the fit. Like Alberta would just be like, we're 51. Like, you know what I mean? Like, but no, that again, we're talking about these 2 different things. We're talking about like, what does it look like in reality, right? Or what is actually going on, and why is he saying this stuff, right? Because the idea of functionally of them becoming the 51st state obviously doesn't make any sense.
No.
And the idea that Trudeau would be the governor of Canada, and then obviously this isn't like a real thing.
No. So then what would the premier of Ontario be, like the
that's right. So but that's too complicated. I mean, I don't think that necessarily means that they or he don't have this aim. It's that it's a simple digestible thing to go, we'll just take it over number 51 no problem.
Sure.
Right.
So let's start with like this thing you've added to our notes about Steve Bannon, right? Who's the
Sure.
many have turned to him as a kind of Trump
Savant.
yeah, or like the person who can read Trump, right? The Nosferatu, or no, not Nosferatu,
Yeah.
Nostradamus. Sorry, my two favorite.
Well, he loves to
Nostr-
make these proclamations that
Right.
make him like he's some sort of visionary.
Some guru who knows what's going on. He says people who think that he's trolling, are missing the point, says Steve Bannon. The predicate for how serious it is, and I'm telling you, it is extremely serious, is about hemispheric defense. Bannon said the president, and we'll have links to all these articles in the show notes. Bannon said the president saw the annexation of Canada as part of a strategic defense plan tied to his demands for control over Greenland and the Panama Canal to give U.S. a dominant security position stretching the length of the continent. He already said the new great game of the 21st century is the Arctic. It's a great power struggle with China and Russia, and we're going to be very involved, said Bannon. So, okay.
I like this. I just have to say I love the quote, Bannon. He's already said the new great game of the 21st century is the Arctic.
Yeah.
Do we have a quote of Trump saying that exact? Like that? I just can't imagine Trump even thinking in that terminology.
Yeah. I mean, this comes back to our recurring theme of the show, namely climate change, right? And that the Arctic is now navigable for large portions of the summer, which historically was not the case. CF all the people that died trying to find the Northwest Passage throughout the history of the age of exploration. And there's certainly some truth to this, right? I mean, presumably there are deposits of oil that are under the Arctic that haven't been, accessed yet. There is logic behind this.
Especially when you tie it all together with Greenland and the Panama Canal. It's not difficult to see the thinking that Bannon's describing, right?
No. I mean, this is very obvious. Although it is kind of funny to be like Panama Canal, Greenland, it's all about the Arctic. It's like, well, Panama Canal, Arctic? But if the Arctic's clear, it's like we have to keep the Arctic occupied and the canal, so then the only way around is under South America. Like, I don't fully grasp.
Well, I think that that last piece of it is also just about, like he's saying, like the hemispheric defense, right? That in terms of controlling that pathway in a world that is more and more susceptible to extreme climate and disruption, right? That this becomes a very valuable piece of property for anything from the facilitation of freer trade to an increased isolationist protectionist stance. That you may as well have it as part of your.
But by the same token, like from a military standpoint, like why is this ridiculous? ICBMs exist? Like what are we talking about here? Right?
Well, yeah. I mean, to me, it's more like I don't. And again, I think that a lot of this is Trump trying to shift the conversation, right? Which again might give him a little too much credit, but I sort of think that ultimately a lot of the things that these exact type of people would want to achieve in a increasingly volatile, environment and ecosystem can be achieved with American power without making territorial claims.
Well, and have been for 100 years.
Yes,
like,
right.
It doesn't make any sense.
But this is the Trump of it all. Is always this idea that America is the one that's being taken advantage of in every single trade deal that like I would wager that America has had a better shake from the advent of NAFTA onwards than Canada.
I mean, since World War II. I mean,
sure, but like, you know what I mean? It's always he's on record being like it's the worst trade deal ever. This classic type of
hyperbole. Yeah,
yeah. It's like I don't remember any time honestly really feeling like wow, America really got screwed by Canada on NAFTA. Is that like,
no? It doesn't make any sense.
What are you talking about?
I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state, said Trump.
Like that too. A contender, like it's The Apprentice.
Like they need our protection, and it's like, okay, from who? Like, is he
Yeah.
imagining Russia is just going to be like sending fleet from across the North Pole to take over Canada if the U.S. doesn't? Like,
Yeah, I'm not the only thing that I mean, we talked about this briefly right after he started making this noise, right? Where like
mm-hmm.
it's the type of thing that sort of spins my head in that granted, he's nuts. I tend to not think that he's this particularly brilliant strategic thinker that a lot of people like to claim that he is. But there is always the chance that this is somebody who has seen the sort of models that his people are giving him about what the next 50 years looks like in on this planet. And I don't know what that means from like a climate perspective or sort of resource perspective or a perspective of potential violence and wars and all that stuff. I have no idea, but like it does seem as though the most logical explanation for this is that he and they think that things are that like social collapse is not actually that improbable over the next handful of decades.
Yeah. I would agree. I mean, he he's obsessed with the fact that we quote unquote lose 200 billion a year with Canada. I'm not going to let that happen. It's too much. Why are we paying 200 billion a year essentially in subsidy to Canada? Now, if you're
Mm-hmm.
the 51st state, I don't mind doing it, says Trump. Um, I
If you're the 51st state, I don't mind having a $200 billion bill. What the hell is he talking
I don't
about?
even understand what he's talking about.
I
Like,
know, I know.
and he's talking about how much money we lose. It's like, do we pay $200 billion to defend Canada? Like, is that how much we're? But it's like we have these planes that cost like $1 billion each. Like what is? What
I
is?
mean, this is the thing. If you look at the type of expenditures that you're talking about on the military, right?
Yeah,
It's not exactly breaking news that Canada, I believe, spends more like closer to 1% of its GDP on the military budget,
sure.
and America spends closer to 4, and it dwarfs and their military, obviously. But like that's the whole point. I mean, the thing about being at the scale of the United States is precisely to be able to exercise hard and soft power
Yeah,
because these places rely on you for protection. That's why you get the better shake in all of these trade
right. It's
deals.
the classic mafia situation,
It's
right?
why, but this is what you were talking. We were talking about this before we came on, and you were saying like it also ties into this USAID stuff. It's like this rejection of global power, right? Like this abandonment of soft power and instead just kind of like complaining about like what is it that you're complaining about that Canada is so dependent on you from a defense perspective that you can basically ask them to do anything? Is that what you're complaining about? You prefer that didn't happen? I don't understand.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's. I mean, it's an irony. I mean, we were talking about this also before, but like in a weird way, what Trump is doing is like the realization of anti-imperial goals of the left of
Mm-hmm.
the past 40 years. I mean, I don't think he's doing it for those reasons, right?
And
I
he's
think
certainly not working towards the type of ends that those people would want.
absolutely not. But that is kind of, it's like what's going to happen if US withdraws its aid to places like Canada, to places like Western Europe, to places like Africa. It's like, well, they're not just going to I mean, we'll talk about this more in a second, but like they're not just going to be like, well, I guess we that's it for us.
We're sitting on a lot of steel. We got a ton of steel and
Yeah.
nowhere to put it.
Yeah, it's like, well, you're going to find some other market, right? And like, what is the other market? Well, it's obviously China, right? I mean, China, Russia, other parts of the world where these goods will be welcomed, right? Will it offset what America did right away? No. But over time, might it?
No.
Possibly. I
Right.
mean,
And like, does
there
a
are a
country
billion
like
people in
Canada,
China. There are a billion people in India. Like, there's a lot of other places in the world.
if you're gonna pull up the drawbridge, then doesn't Canada have far more to relate to a place like the EU than the
Yeah,
United States of America? Like we've reached the point where that is a feasible trade partnership at scale, right? It's not, and again, you can't replace the overall
sure. Not right away.
Not right away. But that's the thing that like my like what's the word, like the galaxy brain where
Yeah.
where it's like okay, the is what's happening, like Trump presents these conditions for Canada, right? Canada doesn't meet them. Some sort of trade war and complete change of the relationship occurs, right? In the meantime, the situation worsens economically, environmentally, whatever, and then it is just time to go in eventually. And you don't have the same political partnership and structure almost purposefully. Like you could just sort of like couldn't America just sort of breathe on Canada and be like in obviously you would think that places like the EU and China and Russia or the greater global order would have something to say, but who knows? Like I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know what actually happens. And I you know, if you try to make any sense of any of this stuff, it it does lead back to some of the, I think, fundamentals of a place like Canada, which we mentioned right at the end of last week. But like, as we move into an increasingly volatile economic and environmental situation, should we do that? Let's say that is what's happening. This is a country that has 40 million people and 7% of the world's fresh water supply.
Yeah.
This is a country that has massive natural resources, natural gas, oil, arable land, cultivated
Timber.
land. I mean, it again, and
minerals,
right now, yes,
aluminum, steel,
and also like a developed economy. So massive steel and all this, like the amount of steel coming out of Quebec is huge for the American market.
Yep.
But the thing is that now you're hearing, and we'll talk about this a bit to sort of as we get to the closer to the end, where it's like the reaction from Canada is, I think, largely legitimate, right? They're like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yep.
This is bullshit. Yep. Trying to like educate American consumers directly. I think it makes sense.
There was a Super Bowl ad about what a great
like,
partner Ontario has been.
Yeah. And but you know, the scary part for me is that again, I look at sort of the decline of centralized government in the United States, the decline of functionality, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. All of these things actually took my whole lifetime, basically.
Yep.
Right? That like Reagan comes in and
almost
from the time
exactly
I'm alive,
your whole lifetime. Yeah.
It starts to eat away. And you know, just like the opposite, every election in my lifetime, they're telling me the Democrats really want to get us public health care. And we never, right? It's this eating away of what is possible and movement towards like, I honestly don't think that even that 20 years ago, I could have considered that Roe v. Wade would actually get overturned. That it wasn't just like a flag to fly for the right wing base. And if you stretch this process out, if you believe in any of the sort of volatility that is and is increasing, then this becomes like when Canadians get up and say, "But you need us." Because we have all of this great stuff, it does kind of give me a little pause, like, oh, it's not about 2025 or 2028, right? Necessarily, or what Trump can do to people. The idea that he's going to be some sort of like hemispheric emperor,
right?
But like, is he putting out the test balloon for what this looks like in 2050? I don't know. Like,
I think that's possible. But the other thing about this is, so Trump paused the initial tariffs that he announced on.
Basically because Canada beefed up its border and got itself a fentanyl czar.
Well, this is a funny thing.
Fentanyl comes across the border.
Less than 1% of the fentanyl entering the United States comes through Canada. Yeah, I think illegal immigration from the northern border is also like a tiny percentage of.
It must be a sweet gig to be the fentanyl czar on the Canadian border.
It's like, well,
what are you doing all day?
Oh, good.
Gonna go take a quick 9 at the golf course. I'll be back by 4.
Yeah, and the other thing is, so we impose 25% tariff on steel, aluminum from Canada.
Like, what is that number? Is it just, does the number just make sense to Trump? Is it, you know what I mean? Is it based on,
I fully think so. I don't
it's just because it's a quarter.
I don't think there's
25%.
there's not some economist who's like, if we do 25%, that's going to push
25's where we want to be. That's the sweet spot.
Yeah. But it's also like, it's not as if just doing that immediately out of thin air conjures steel and aluminum processing facilities in America that can take the place, or supplies, right? It's not like miners like emerge out of the earth like in a Greek myth to replace the production that's lost. So it's like, who's this going to hurt? Well, it's going to hurt American business that relies on these things. It's going to hurt the American consumers that buy products that you know what aluminum is there, Michael? Everything.
And Trump himself has already come out and been like, Americans might need to get ready for some pain,
some belt tightening.
Like right after being like, every price is coming down. The horror of Biden inflation is over. You know, now I mean,
inflation is already back up. Like eggs are now like $9 or whatever.
Yeah, just $9 for the dozen.
It doesn't really make a lot of sense.
But what's interesting is that, you know, just to sort of wrap up what we're talking about, in terms of this weird, almost like you said before, abdication of power,
of empire,
of empire, is that,
which again, like I'm in favor of, but just perhaps not in this.
Sure, not in this way. Yeah.
Not in a way that like leaves starving children to die.
And because it's also like not real. Again, like I wonder what.
Well, no, it's being replaced by an older idea of empire, which is like we take over countries. And they become states or whatever.
Right. And so, if you look at what's going on in Canada right now, right, it's a great example of the amount of soft power and hard power, but soft power in particular, that America has exercised over Canada for my whole life is just like clear as day. Even with like even CanCon rules, like the cultural infusion of America is undeniable. I mean, it's like, you know, like what it's the biggest like sporting like television event of the year is the Super Bowl. You know, it's like we're not.
It's not the Grey Cup, Michael.
It worked. You know what I mean? Like your control over the hemisphere is unquestioned.
Sure.
And this is a moment politically where Trudeau, who, you know, Canada's sort of own little milquetoast liberal dude who's been in power for a while now. 9
years, right? A long time.
As they seem to love these little decade stretches up there. It's like Chrétien, Harper, hit Trudeau. And this like pocketbook Trumpite weirdo Poilievre is now running.
Poilievre, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I know.
He's 45, by the way. He's like almost. I'm like he's my age, basically.
Could have been us. I know. Yeah. Maybe it will. Maybe it will next time. But like, the federal polls are closing. I mean, Trudeau had left the Liberals for dead.
Yeah, and now he's out, and a new is it going to be?
He's out, but like I think everyone thought that even just him leaving would help somewhat, but it seems quite clear that this has
it's neck and neck now, right?
And like it weirdly has like given a very clear identity that's like distasteful for the right now. It's bad branding. They shifted their election slogan to Canada First.
Yeah.
Right? Sort of right in the moment when America First people are like now hated, like at an extreme level across Canada, right? And so he's kind of in a tough spot.
Well, there was this New York Times piece that came out just the other day. For Poilievre, the biggest challenge is that for the last 2 years, the villain in his story was Trudeau. The villain is now leaving, and there's a new, bigger, badder villain that is coming from outside. That is Donald Trump, right? Like,
that him and his people have been like cozying up to, right?
Oh yeah, I mean Doug Ford, the living Ford, R.I.P. Gone too soon. Doug Ford has been like. He was like crying. I love Mr. Trump. I can't believe he would do this to us about the right. It's this. It's hilarious, right?
And also in Quebec, right? The polls that are coming out of Quebec are like showing an increase in nationalism and patriotism in a connection to Canada. Like it's some of the highest in years. People, right? Like, because it has had them
They're
rally
like, well, we
around.
have problems with Canada, but like that would be much worse,
That would
essentially.
be much, much worse. I mean, you think they can't like Quebec hates Ottawa.
Oh
Do you
yeah.
understand how Quebec would hate DC? And this it's like, is this a miscalculation? Because you were going to have
An ally to the
um
north.
now I'm not saying he won't win or he might get some sort of small majority or minority government. He's probably going to get the most seats, I think. But like, this is a guy who probably would have, you could have just walked right over. And
Oh
you
yeah.
and everything about this, I mean, you've got Canadians like canceling vacations to like Michigan. Like, what are you talking? Like, none of the it's all of these unforced errors that have started to, and it shows, right? The power of America that it seems to be confused about how to use right now, that these actions can so plainly influence the electoral process of another country.
Yeah. It's it's hilarious. Just to like wrap up, I want to talk about this piece that I found in The Conversation by Aisha Ahmad, which is about what would happen if Trump just invaded and conquered Canada, right?
Yes.
And it's like, well, the cities would be pretty easy to capture, but the problem is you got all that wilderness, right? And this piece imagines this. Aisha Ahmad is a U of T professor who specializes in the history of resistance movements, and like basically, if Trump ever decides to use military force to annex Canada, the result would not be determined by a conventional military confrontation. Rather, a military invasion of Canada would trigger a decades-long resistance, which would ultimately destroy the United States. And I think it's funny. She says, Trump is delusional if he believes 40 million Canadians will passively accept conquest without resistance. Yeah. How do you feel about that, Michael?
I'd hate to get caught in the crossfire, like brothers versus brothers type thing. I don't want to have to go to war with Andrew.
Sure.
I don't know. I'm not quite as certain. I do think that there would be massive resistance.
Right, but you don't necessarily imagine like the Maquis like doing sabotages or.
I mean, I guess like I would say I'm more encouraged that would happen after the response,
just the booing at the anthem and stuff, and
yeah. That were a stone's throw away from a Che Guevara eating a beaver tail. Like, I'm sure.
he's got like a Davy Crockett hat on.
I guess I mean that, like, it again, the size of the disparity in military power is unquestionable, but let's be honest, like, America's had a few different battles where they've had a pretty sizable lead in the military side of things, and it's not exactly gone all that smoothly, right? Like, it's
Vietnam,
not the only
Afghanistan, Iraq, et cetera.
I don't know how the country would react, but I do think that Ahmad is largely correct. That I don't know if their conclusion of it would ultimately destroy the United States
seems a little bit overblown, but because I think the thought is Canadians would then come into America and blow up stuff in Atlanta and Fresno or whatever.
I mean, that
it would be like the Troubles or something.
It's a fascinating question because a lot of Canadian nationalism, as it has been articulated in the time, even let's say particularly in the COVID and post-COVID world,
sure,
has found itself on a right wing closer to Trump and closer to people like Trump than ever before.
Right, like the trucker convoy
and so what would be a fascinating political shift would be if America and Trump and whoever did turn its actual ire onto Canada, how that nationalism changes, reacts, right?
Yeah.
And because the association that a lot of people have in Canada with the flag flying in the moment before all this started really playing out was on that side of thing, kind of like the convoy people, and certainly belonging more to this group that thought they should start running on Canada first. That's who they are appealing to, right? that Trudeau was still this sort of holdover of this thing that when I was growing up there was like a true point of pride, sort of the
cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, right. Like assimilation over, the melting pot.
Yep.
And it is, you do sort of, I sense that there is a shift already in just this idiotic proclamation.
Just in the last month. Yeah.
25 cents on every dollar or whatever the hell he thinks is going to happen. So I think in a scenario where this actually like got ramped up into some sort of fantastical military invasion, I would find it very hard to believe that it would just sort of like tick over. I don't know what it would look like. Again, we're comparing it to places like Vietnam and Afghanistan. Like the resistance forces there also have like a history of arms and guerrilla warfare. There's no
War of 1812, Michael. Canada does as well.
Yeah, gonna have to dial it back a little further. Yeah, exactly.
Like 200 years,
Yeah, but I mean, here's hoping it doesn't happen. I don't want to have to.
Oh God, no.
Because I would become one of those people that would, you're a dual national, like.
Some of my best friends are Canadian, Michael.
Can get exiled from both places. Man without a country.
Luckily, you have a third country you could go to, though.
Yeah.
But not at all.
I'm sure Trump will get to the UK eventually.
Not at all collapsing United Kingdom.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, I think that's good for our discussion of Canada and the sort of apocalyptic overtones of this first month of the Trump administration.
Yeah, and of course we'll happily
check back in.
The situation continues to
fully 17% of our listenership is in Canada. So
yeah. Although I'm sure some of them are going to leave after they realize that I don't even know how many provinces there are. I think I'm going to guess 10.
That was good. I love that.
The territories? There's territories too. Yeah.
But in the meantime, if you like the show, you can follow us on Instagram at the end of the world WMS, and you could leave a review for the show on the podcatcher of your choice, where you can also subscribe to hear our weekly episodes. Next week, we are going to be talking about a comic book, one of the most famous comic books of all time, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, which sort of turned the comics world on its head almost 40 years ago, and is very explicitly about the politicization of the apocalypse in ways that hopefully will be interesting.
Our first comic ever, so tune in.
And I am a comic junkie, so I've been wanting to sneak this one in for a while. It only took me 56 episodes to get there. But until then, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and we'll talk to you real soon.